A missing man is found murdered in Schenectady, New York.
Not only was he obviously dead, he was nearly frozen. He had at least 2 ligature marks around his neck.
This was a homicide. He died by strangulation.
His loved ones claim he didn't have enemies.
He was nurturing and caring.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal.
I said, something's up, more than meets the eye here.
But the clues point detectives to the last people anyone would have expected.
They got together and said, we got to get rid of him.
He was in love with her and wanted to end a toxic marriage so that they could be together.
She manipulated this whole thing. She was the puppet master.
November 23rd, 1995. It's Thanksgiving Day in Schenectady, New York. But instead of celebrating with her family, 30-year-old Stella Lacy is calling police to report her husband, Paul Lacy, missing.
She had seen Paul the previous evening. She went up to bed around 11:30. Paul was downstairs rummaging around the kitchen for something to eat and never came up to bed, which was not unusual. He would sleep on a couch or a day bed on the first floor or go out late, but not coming home that night or the next day was unusual because it was Thanksgiving Day.
It was very odd that Uncle Paul wouldn't be at Thanksgiving, you know. His life revolved around family.
The Schenectady Police Department dispatched somebody to her house to conduct an initial interview.
Officers ask Stella to walk them through the day leading up to Paul's disappearance.
She told the patrolman that Paul had worked Thanksgiving Eve during the day. Ron Faulkner, who was Paul's first cousin, was actually living in the house and had been renting a room from the Lacys. When Paul got home from work, she sent Ron and Paul out to get some bread for the stuffing and a couple other items. And she continued to make Thanksgiving dinner.
Stella says Paul and Ron returned from the store around 11 p.m.
There was a neighbor who lived kitty corner to Lacy's home. His name was Calvin Smith. And at this time, he stopped over and just to socialize with Ron and Paul, and she went up to bed.
Paul doesn't come to bed that night. The next morning, she believes he may have left to go to work. She had paged him. He doesn't come back, and that's what precipitates her initial filing of the missing persons report.
To go missing on Thanksgiving, it hit us all hard because it's like, we know Paul, and he always come home. So this was abnormal.
It's not even 24 hours, but if someone's reported missing, they're put into a national database. In this case, there was a vehicle involved. It's 1986 Volvo with a New York plate on it. All this is entered into a database.
The patrol officer asked for a recent photo of her husband, Paul, and if there was any extenuating circumstances that she should know about.
She said he was not a drug user, but Paul was under a lot of pressure. They had some money issues. He lost his job, even though he got a new job at a local Coca-Cola warehouse. You know, they owed a lot of money. Additionally, she said he recently cashed out his 401k for about $8,000, but Paul wouldn't leave the family and the kids on a holiday. At this point, patrolmen interviewed neighbors, but we really didn't get any good leads.
His devotion to his family makes the disappearance even harder to explain. 2 days into the investigation, a tip comes in.
At about 2:30 p.m., the Schenectady Police Department gets a call from a person living 2.5 blocks from where the Lacys lived. saying that there was a car parked on a one-way street in front of their house, parked the wrong way.
There was a man sleeping in the car. The officers that responded made numerous attempts, pounding on the glass, knocking on the side of the car, and they felt that it was necessary to call for EMS.
They opened the door and tried to wake this person up. Not only was he obviously dead, he was nearly frozen.
They found no wallet, but they did find, by going through his pockets, an identification card. Then the police knew that this was Paul Lacy.
Paul Lacy was born May 12, 1964, in Albany, New York. He and his younger sister were part of a large extended family.
He was a loving brother. We always were watching cartoons. He used to take me to school. I was littler than him, so I walked slower, so I was pretty much led around, you know.
We had very strong mothers, and then it turned us into decent people.
Paul was always a happy kid. He always enjoyed life. Anything that he did, it was done because of his doing. What made him happy, that's what he did. Paul's father wasn't really in his life. I had to depend on the welfare system. But I was always going to take care of my kids.
After high school in the early 80s, Paul started working at a local market. He quickly rose to become a manager. It was also the place he met his future wife, Stella Close.
Stella and her family was in our neighborhood. Her dad was a hardworking man. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom, for what I could tell. So Stella had a stable home. She had dated a couple guys that were not as nice as Paul. He was nurturing and caring. He wanted to have somebody to love. She started coming around. And then next thing you know, they're getting married.
The young couple married in 1986. In the years that followed, Paul and Stella built a life together, including 3 beautiful children.
He decided to go into his career at Cargill, which is a flour mill at the Port of Albany.
Pretty much any job you got that was down at the Port of Albany, they paid you well.
Whatever his wife, Stella, wanted, he made it for her or got it for her. And it started with a car. Then he bought her a house, had a pool put in. He provided everything for that family.
And you know how it feels to not have a real father that you've been longing for. Therefore, you're going to be a stand-up man, and he decided to be that stand-up guy for his family.
Paul strove to be the best father he could be for his children, ages 9, 7, and 16 months.
Paul had 3 kids, a girl, a boy, a girl. That's what Paul wanted. His heart was kind. He would always make sure whoever he did for, he was going to do his best by him. He didn't care who you was.
As far as Paul, his aspirations, each one was just a milestone. It became setting up for retirement, setting up for his children's education. So, yeah, his goals kept getting higher and higher.
But 2 days after Thanksgiving Day, 1995, Paul has been found deceased. At first glance, it's unclear how he died.
The keys were on the floor in the front seat. There was no broken glass anywhere. His clothes weren't disheveled like there was a struggle. There was no blood. There was no gunshots. There was no knife wounds.
While there are no obvious wounds on Paul's body, closer inspection reveals a telltale sign of foul play.
he had at least 2 rounds of ligature marks around his neck. He was strangled.
There isn't much room in the back seat of this car, this Volvo. So it would have been very difficult for whoever killed Paul to have strangled him from the back seat.
That would tell me it took a person of size and or strength to pull this off, and that it wasn't done in his car, it was done elsewhere, and then Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene.
Strangulation is not a typical means of death in a robbery case. People who strangle other people usually have a personal relationship. It could have been by someone who was close to him.
Coming up, investigators learn about a recent feud.
Paul put his foot down and said no. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
And a possible suspect shifts the course of the investigation.
I said, we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here.
Two days after Paul Lacy was reported missing, his dead body has been found less than 3 blocks away from home. And investigators are trying to determine why.
There was no jewelry on him at that time, although he was known to wear 3 rings, which he did not have on. His pockets and his black jeans were turned inside out. It could be construed as a robbery gone bad or a robbery/murder. And the fact that Stella said that he carried a large amount of money on him at all times would point to that fact for sure. The only thing that they found was a pager on his belt. They downloaded the pager information. Stella told the responding officers that she did try paging him and he didn't respond. So it pretty much corroborated Stella's story.
After assisting the forensics people from the state police, it was determined that the body was going to be removed from the vehicle and would be shipped for autopsy. Then, investigators made the notification right away.
We asked Stella to come to the police department. She was given what is essentially a death notification. She started crying, seemed very upset. When she settled down, we said, now you need to help us help you and find out what happened to Paul. She's traumatized at this point. We found her husband dead. She's got 3 children. If she makes a mistake in a statement, we're going to let it go. But we do find some inconsistencies with what she tells us versus what she told the responding patrolman to report him missing. She said she saw him eat a salami sandwich at 11:30, which she did not tell the responding officers initially. She also said that Paul came up to bed on Thanksgiving Eve and got in bed with her, that he wanted to have sex, but she turned him down. Even though there was inconsistencies, we have to take that into consideration. Emotions, finite details that she may or may not have forgotten. So we don't push her on that, because you don't want to paint her in a corner yet until we know more.
This time, when Stella describes the events leading up to Paul's disappearance, she leaves out mention of their neighbor Calvin. But she has another theory about who might be involved.
As far as she knew, he never cheated on her, and she stated she never cheated on him, other than some financial pressures that they were under. On the surface, they had a good marriage. But Stella said that he did have an ongoing feud with a first cousin by the name of David Womack, who actually lived with them for a few months.
His older cousin needed him, and he provided a place for him, where the other family members were like, no, you're not staying with us, Paul. was the one that was kind-hearted.
Stella says the arrangement quickly turned sour. And on November 3rd, 3 weeks before Paul's body was discovered, the conflict between the cousins escalated.
David would get into these rage-type arguments, stuff like that. He always had guns and stuff. But Paul was not like that. Paul wasn't a physical fighter. David Womack had an issue with his anger. So he probably thought he could bully Paul and stay there. Well, Paul put his foot down and said no. Told him he had to go. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
Paul kicked him out of the house. And according to Paul Lacy, his cousin Dave Womack sliced tires on Paul's cars.
While David was never charged in the tire slashing incident, Paul's allegations pushed their relationship to a breaking point.
Paul Lacy kicked his cousin Womack out of the house, but he allowed another cousin, Ron Faulkner, to rent a room in the house.
Investigators tracked David down for an interview.
Of course, he denied any involvement and said he hadn't seen Paul in quite a while. And in fact, definitely he didn't see Paul Thanksgiving Eve or Thanksgiving.
David claims he went hunting with his sons on Thanksgiving Day.
That was corroborated by friends and family alike. Although he was very suspect at this point, his alibi was corroborated.
With David ruled out as a possible suspect, detectives hope Paul's autopsy will give them a new lead.
The ligature marks left bruising and a distinctive pattern around his neck.
The medical examiner had determined that, in fact, this was a homicide. It was further determined that Mr. Lacy had died by strangulation caused by ligature.
This is not an exact science in terms of time of death. The fact that Paul had been, quote-unquote, frozen because of the weather and actually had been dead for some time, the ME cannot put, days on it. So we had to rely on the stomach contents and statement of Stella saying he ate a salami sandwich at 11:30 at night, Thanksgiving Eve. But Paul's stomach was empty, which would indicate that he hadn't eaten.
One of the last people to see him alive says that he is eating a sandwich or having a meal. The autopsy report is inconsistent with that. At this point, they're highly skeptical of those initial reports.
We still had a lot of unanswered questions. And now that Stella may or may not be involved, the pressure's on us to find other physical evidence or real evidence or eyewitnesses. But Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene. Like, where did this actually happen?
Investigators have received Paul Lacy's autopsy report, which contradicts his wife Stella Lacy's story. But with little evidence to go on, police can't be certain of anything. They know the answers they seek likely depend on finding where the murder took place.
Well, how about his house? That's where he's supposed to be. And the last time Stella saw him, getting a search warrant's a pretty heavy lift, and it takes time. So we asked Stella for consent to search. Paul's first cousin, Ron, who lived there, they both consented. There's investigators throughout the house, upstairs, downstairs, in bedrooms and bathrooms and closets, drawers, private places. And at one point, while I was there, a man just walked into the back door into the kitchen. Didn't knock. We nodded to each other, said hello, and he immediately went to the turkey, the Thanksgiving turkey, ripped off a leg, started eating it, and I said, who are you? And he said that he was a neighbor, identified himself as Calvin Smith.
Calvin Smith was another man who was in the house that night that Paul Lacy disappeared. Stella neglected to mention that Calvin was there in her second interview with the police.
He said, yeah, this is really sad about what happened to Paul. I said, yeah, but we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here. They certainly got my attention. I said, what do you mean by that? He shrugged his shoulders. He was just as calm, cool, and collected as could be. He's eating a leg off a turkey dinner. And I took note of that. And I said, something's up. More than meets the eye here. You know, again, it's common sense. The speculation is that it happened here. I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on him right then because we didn't know, was he involved? Was someone in the house involved? So I just let it go. But of course, I told the rest of the team.
After concluding their search, investigators' suspicions are reinforced by another tip.
There was an anonymous call that came in that the origin was never identified, but indicated that Paul Lacy had very poor eyesight and needed to wear his glasses all the time.
After we got that phone call from a friend, we immediately, started thinking, where are the glasses? There were no glasses in the car. So that tells you pretty much that he didn't drive there where he was found.
At that point, investigation goes back to the last place where he was seen alive with his wife, Ron Faulkner, and Calvin Smith.
We decided that we need to talk to Ron, Calvin, and Stella for the third time and bring them into the police department to talk to individually. They weren't under arrest, but we had a plan. We're going to interview them separately and be able to pull apart their stories or corroborate their stories. If someone's lying, it's hard to keep up a lie, and one lie leads to another. The inconsistencies that may or may not have meant something early on come into focus a lot more when you add them up. One or all of them are involved, and it did happen in the house.
Coming up, detectives expose a marriage in distress.
She finally admits, I've been having an affair. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary.
And a shocking confession turns the case upside down.
She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
On November 27, 1995, 2 days after Paul Lacy was found murdered in the backseat of his car, investigators attempt to verify his final moments with the 3 people who saw him last. Paul's wife, Stella Lacy, his friend Calvin Smith, and his cousin, Ronald Faulkner.
We start by interviewing Stella. I can tell that she's nervous now. She's got a whole different demeanor. And she knows that Ron and Calvin are being talked to in adjacent rooms.
Contrary to what she initially told police, Stella admits she and Paul were having problems.
the marriage wasn't as rosy as she initially painted a picture of, and that Paul always wanted sex, and that was something she wasn't willing to participate in as much as he wanted to. He was a free spender, and they had filed Chapter 13 to protect the house and their vehicles, but he was spending money, according to her, hand over fist.
Stella says she began spending more time with Paul's cousin, Ron.
Ron, took care of a lot of chores around the house, was Uncle Ron to the 3 kids.
She told police that Ron was a breath of fresh air and could talk to her and she could talk to him and he would listen, unlike Paul.
She finally admits, in fact, she says, I've been having an affair with Ron for about a year. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary. I asked her if she loved Ron, and she said actually she didn't, but house-wise, it was a good thing for him to be there for babysitting, cleaning, chores, etc. But it was just like a convenience. In terms of motive, she's having an affair with Paul's first cousin, Ron, who's living in the home and had been there for about 6 or 7 months. Secondly, there's a money issue, and she finally admits that Paul had 2 life insurance policies worth $50,000.
Stella admits that over time, she and Ron began to fantasize about life without her husband.
She told me that both her and Ron disliked Paul and even hated him, and they talked about getting rid of Paul.
Stella said she never thought that was being taken seriously.
But Stella says on Thanksgiving Eve, Ron surprised her.
She went up to bed. Paul came up a short time after and got in bed, wanted to have sex with her. She turned him down, and they were in bed for the night. Within a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes or so, she said that Ron yelled upstairs.
Ron yelled up the stairs that Paul had a phone call, and he suggested Paul come down and take the call. According to Stella, he was only gone a few minutes, and then Ron went back up the stairs and asked Stella to come down.
She walked in the room and just saw Paul face down in Ron's bedroom with a pink blanket over his head.
In the room besides Ron was Kelvin Smith, the neighbor that had been over to the house that evening. She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
They said, we got to get rid of him. She went back upstairs, got his shoes, pants, shirt, his belt, his pager, dressed him, all 3 of them, because it's not easy to dress a dead body. Calvin and Ron loaded Paul in the back seat of his Volvo. Stella said, I'll stay here and clean up the mess. She also said that Calvin had the rope they used to strangle him and told Calvin to get rid of the rope. And she told me that he flushed it down the toilet.
After they lowered Paul's body in the back seat, Ron drove the car. And he drove the car a couple of blocks away.
The 3 of them got together and said, here's what we're going to do. We'll make sure our stories match. And the biggest thing was that we're going to say it looked like a robbery. Here's Paul's 3 rings, which they removed from his hand after they killed him, and the money out of his pockets. Stella said, I'll wait till tomorrow to report Paul missing, and I'll beep him several times throughout the day so the police will think that I was really worried about him, that everything's going to be fine.
Stella's confession seems to explain everything, but detectives sense she is downplaying her involvement.
I don't know how true her confession is or not. I've got enough to believe that she's telling the truth to a point, but we need to talk to Ron and Calvin. and put their stories together and see how close they are matching.
Coming up, the grisly details of the murder come to light.
He said, all right, I did it. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that.
And a confessed killer describes Paul's last moments.
He kisses Paul on the forehead and tells him, I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace.
New York authorities are investigating the strangulation death of Paul Lacy. While his wife, Stella Lacy, is naming her husband's cousin and neighbor in his murder, detectives are in other rooms with the two men trying to get their versions of the story.
I found out that Calvin was not admitting to anything, so I said, let me try. He denied being involved at all, so I asked him if he put his hands on the rope, and he said he did not. I said, Calvin, do you know what a rope is made of? And he kind of said, yeah, I guess. And I said, well, it's made of fibers. If you touch that rope, you're going to have these fibers embedded in your hand. Well, this is definitely not true, but Calvin seemed to be believing me. I told him that the PD had just purchased a fiber detection instrument. Now, this is 1995. Copy machines were brand new, big piece of equipment. Schenectady PD had purchased one recently, so I took him out of the interview room and I told him that was the fiber detection instrument. I lifted up the cover, as you would place a piece of paper there, and I said, we're going to stick your hand in that, and we're going to hit the detection button, or whatever I called it. And he put his hand down. You know, the bright light comes on. I said, don't look at the light. He pulled his hand away.
The investigator's ruse has the intended effect.
Right there at the copy machine, he said, all right, I did it. I strangled Paul. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that. I felt bad for Calvin that I had tricked him, but I can do that. I didn't interfere with his right to due process or convince an innocent person to confess to something he didn't do, all within the guidelines of the law.
According to Calvin, Stella wasn't an innocent bystander. He says he went along with the murder because she promised to give him $100 up front, along with a cut from the insurance payout.
Stella said, I'm going to give you some money. He thought maybe this is life-changing money. They also took the rings off Paul's fingers.
Calvin thought he'd get a lot of money for those 3 rings, and instead, all he got for the total for the 3 rings was $40.
When they question Ron Faulkner, he confesses as well, but with a different motive than Calvin.
He was in love with Stella and wanted to end a toxic relationship in the marriage so that they could be together.
Ron knew that her relationship with Paul was not what she wanted.
Ron said he'd do anything to make Stella happy. So while he was out running errands with Paul and Calvin the night before Thanksgiving, he decided to make the fantasy a reality.
Ron said, here's what we're going to do. Calvin, you get the rope, because you're a big guy, and you can hide behind my bedroom door. I'm going to yell up to Paul. When he comes in, you put that rope around him twice and just pull as hard as you can. Which, by Calvin's account and Ron's account, this is how it went down. Calvin just pulled as hard as he could for a couple minutes, And Ron actually jumped on top of Calvin to put more weight on Paul.
As he's dying, Ron leans forward, kisses Paul on the forehead, and tells him, "I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace."
Paul's body was found on Saturday, November 25th. 3 days later, Ron, Calvin, and Stella were arrested. All three were charged with murder, tampering with evidence, conspiracy.
While they all face the same charges, investigators believe Stella was the driving force behind the crime.
Stella, I think, manipulated them both into doing it. She was the puppet master.
I was shocked that Calvin, Ronald, and Stella had murdered my brother over insurance money with Stella. Anything she wanted, my brother would have gave it to her. It was senseless that she would even go to those extremes.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal, that type of pain that you would inflict on someone that you care about for money.
Paul's family relies on prosecutors to exact justice. But when it comes to Stella, they have major concerns.
Although I think Stella orchestrated this, it's hard for a jury to put someone away for life, even though they planned it. We have to make sure we did our job and the evidence is enough to take it to trial. You build the best case, because you're going to get one shot at this.
In August 1996, Stella Lacy goes on trial for the murder of her husband, Paul Lacy. Her alleged co-conspirators decide to take plea deals instead.
Ronald and Calvin, they were facing a potential death penalty case. And sure, their attorneys advised them that their only shot to save their own skin by pleading to the lesser murder charges rather than face potential death penalty.
Calvin pled guilty to first-degree murder, was sentenced to 25 to life. Ron decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder and also received 25 to life.
As part of his agreement, Calvin provides testimony against Stella. Prosecutors do not require the same of Ron.
He was in love with her and would never harm her.
Stella's demeanor during the trial was cold, very cold, stone-faced.
The defense strategy was that she did not participate in the murder, only became aware of it after the fact when Ron and Calvin notify her, and that her involvement was to help dispose of the body.
However, Calvin denies such claims. He testifies that Stella was the one that told him Paul's death needed to look like a robbery. He also claims that Stella wanted it to happen before the holiday.
Calvin indicated Stella had tried to do some pre-planning and that her representation that she was totally insulated from the actual homicide was incorrect.
Paul's cousin, David Womack, takes the stand as a witness. He testifies that Stella not only knew about the murder, she was the one who planned it.
His testimony was that he was approached by Stella and offered $10,000 to kill Paul.
Womack's statement shows that Stella had thought about this in advance.
But it doesn't seem to be enough for the jury.
Womack's credibility was terrible. He never reported to police that she had approached him, so, it looked like sour grapes on his part. The jury didn't believe his testimony. She was actually found not guilty of first-degree murder.
She was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution.
She was sentenced 10 to 32 years in state prison.
The first reaction was upset, anger. We tried to let the justice system do their job, but it failed us.
I feel like Stella got a break. She should have did more time than anyone else because this was all her plan.
Of course, I was disappointed. I take that as a loss. We did our job. I think she manipulated this whole thing. The fact that she did not actually physically participate in the murder is tough, I think, for a jury to take it to the level to send her to prison for life.
Paul did not deserve to have his life taken away because of somebody's greed. He deserved better, and he didn't get that.
Paul had an infectious smile. He had a hug that would warm you to the bone. His generosity was unlimited. We still talk about him today. 30 years later, we keep him alive in our heart.
With Paul, it's like, I know he's safe. I don't have to worry about him. And that's the way I go forward with my life.
The desert does not keep secrets quietly. It buries them, seals them under heat, sand, and silence until the earth itself forgets what it once swallowed, and on a morning that began like any other in the outskirts of Arizona. That silence finally broke when a maintenance worker stopped his truck along a cracked service road and noticed something half exposed in the sand that should not have been there. Not in this place, not like this. A single pale shape that looked too deliberate to be random, too human to be ignored. And when he stepped closer, the wind shifted and carried with it a smell that made his stomach turn instantly. A thick, rotten sweetness that clung to the back of his throat and told him before his mind could accept it that the ground beneath him was not just earth anymore, but a grave that had been waiting for someone to find it. And when sheriff's deputies arrived minutes later, they sealed off the area with a sense of urgency that came not from certainty, but from experience. Because in the desert, nothing is accidental, and everything uncovered has a story that someone tried very hard to erase. And as they pushed through dry brush and fractured stone, they found a shallow depression barely concealed under scattered rocks, a burial so rushed it almost looked like panic had guided the hands that made it. And inside it they found the remains of a young woman whose identity would not be confirmed for hours, but whose presence immediately transformed the site into something far larger than a simple recovery, because the position of the body, the bindings around the wrists, and the absence of any personal belongings told investigators this was not an accident, not exposure, not misfortune, but something deliberate, controlled, and deeply personal. And as the sun climbed higher and the desert heat began to distort the air above the ground, detectives realized they were standing at the center of a case that had already been dead for years before it was ever discovered, a cold case that had finally resurfaced from beneath a decade of silence, and the name that would eventually emerge from forensic confirmation was Emily Grayson. 20 years old, a waitress, a student, a young woman whose life had once been ordinary enough to disappear without warning, yet meaningful enough to leave behind a family that never stopped looking even when the world had moved on. And as investigators traced her story back to the night she vanished, they entered a timeline that had been frozen in confusion since 1995, a night that began with routine shifts, fluorescent lights, and the hum of a roadside diner off Interstate 17 where Emily was last seen finishing her work. Checking the parking lot repeatedly as if expecting someone she did not want to see. According to coworkers who later told police, she seemed distracted, uneasy, even frightened in a way she could not explain, and when she left that night there was no dramatic farewell. No indication she would never return, only a quiet exit through a back door into a parking lot that would become the last confirmed sighting of her alive, after which the details fractured immediately into conflicting witness accounts, a cashier recalling an argument outside the diner, a truck driver insisting he saw a woman matching her description near a dark pickup, another witness describing distant screams that were later dismissed as unreliable memories shaped by time and rumor. And within 72 hours her car was found abandoned in a supermarket lot miles away from her apartment. Doors unlocked, keys missing, no visible struggle inside. Nothing to suggest violence except the absence of the person who should have been there. And at first investigators treated it like so many missing person cases that begin with hope and end with uncertainty, assuming she had left voluntarily, maybe overwhelmed, maybe hiding, maybe simply gone. But that theory collapsed as soon as the first message surfaced from her answering machine. A recording that would later become one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the entire investigation, 11 seconds of static, breathing, and a male voice speaking 4 words that were never publicly released in full but were described in case files as calm, deliberate, and chillingly certain. She knows what happened, followed by a sudden cut that left silence that felt heavier than sound, and after that message the case changed shape in the public mind. No longer a disappearance, but something closer to a warning, a confession, or a threat that had not yet completed itself. And yet despite the fear it generated, leads collapsed one after another as investigators chased hundreds of tips that led nowhere, psychics, false confessions, rumors, and dead ends scattered across desert towns and county lines. While Emily's family refused to accept the growing silence of the investigation and continued organizing searches, posting flyers, speaking to media, holding vigils that slowly shrank in attendance, but never in desperation. Until eventually the case settled into the pattern of many unsolved disappearances, present enough to haunt those who remembered, but distant enough for the system to shelve. And for years, that is exactly what happened. Until a retired detective reviewing old files noticed something that had been overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it had never been fully connected. A repeated reference to Emily's growing fear in the weeks before she vanished. Co-workers were calling her checking outside repeatedly, mentioning someone who had been following her, a detail dismissed at the time as anxiety, but now seen differently through the lens of what was found in the desert. And as investigators reopened old evidence boxes, they found inconsistencies that had never been resolved, including the detail of a delivery of red roses to her workplace days before she disappeared. No card, no sender, only a presence implied but never identified, and while that alone was not enough to build a case, it created a pattern that began to align with something far more disturbing when another set of remains was discovered in a separate desert location years later, belonging to a different young woman with a similar timeline of disappearance, similar circumstances, and similar signs of restraint, suggesting that Emily's case might not have been isolated at all, but part of something far larger operating in silence across the same terrain for years. And as investigators began to connect geographic points on a map, a pattern emerged that pointed not just to where victims were found, but to where they had last been seen, drawing lines that crossed highways, service roads, and isolated industrial zones where witnesses reported dark vehicles and brief encounters that at the time seemed insignificant. And in the middle of those overlapping patterns, one name began to appear repeatedly in old interview notes, a family member who had been close enough to assist in searches, close enough to speak to reporters, close enough to appear in photographs, standing beside grieving relatives. Daniel Grayson, Emily's cousin, someone who had been present from the very beginning of the investigation, someone who had provided statements, offered comfort, and helped coordinate search efforts, someone who investigators had cleared quickly during the original inquiry due to lack of evidence. but whose presence now took on a different weight when re-examined through inconsistencies in timelines, employment records, and vehicle descriptions that matched vague witness recollections from the night Emily vanished, and though none of it yet proved anything. The discomfort it created within the reopened case was immediate and irreversible, because in cold cases the most dangerous realization is not what is found, but what was always there and never seen, and as the desert continued to reveal fragments of the past buried beneath its surface. Investigators understood they were no longer just searching for what happened to Emily Grayson. They were searching for how long the truth had been waiting in plain sight before the ground finally gave it back. The reopening of Emily Grayson's case did not begin with a dramatic announcement or a press conference filled with flashing cameras and confident statements. It began in silence. In a windowless room deep inside a county records building where a retired detective laid out boxes that had not been opened in years and realized how easily a life could disappear twice, once in the world and once in paperwork. And as he spread photographs across a metal table under flickering fluorescent light, he noticed something that should have been obvious from the beginning but had been buried beneath urgency and assumption, a subtle pattern of proximity, not just who Emily was seen with, but who was always nearby in the periphery of every account, every search, every recollection of the days before she vanished, and that name, repeated in margins of old interview notes and half-ignored statements, was Daniel Grayson, her cousin. Present in nearly every narrative thread, yet never positioned as central, always just outside suspicion like a shadow that moved only when attention was elsewhere, and as investigators began reconstructing the final week of Emily's life with modern analytical tools, they discovered that the timeline from 1995 was not as fragmented as it had once seemed, but disturbingly coherent when viewed through the lens of geography and opportunity. Because every point connected to Emily's last known movements formed a radius that overlapped with Daniel's verified locations during that same period, something that had never been charted before, because no one had thought to compare family movements with victim movements at such precision. And that oversight now felt less like an error and more like a blind spot that had cost years of truth. The first formal shift came when investigators re-interviewed witnesses from the original diner sighting, not as routine follow-ups, but as structured cognitive reinvestigations designed to strip away contamination from time and rumor, and what emerged was not new information but clarified memory. Details that had always been present but never fully examined, such as the description of a dark pickup truck parked at the edge of the lot on the night Emily disappeared, its engine idling longer than necessary. Its presence noticed by multiple employees but never reported as suspicious at the time because it belonged to someone familiar in the area, and when that description was cross-referenced with vehicle registrations from the mid-1990s, one name appeared in the system linked to a black Ford pickup registered under Daniel Grayson's name. A detail that alone was not incriminating but became significant when layered with another witness statement describing a man seen arguing with a young woman outside the diner shortly before closing hours, a man whose build, posture, and voice matched the general description of Daniel provided by family members in earlier interviews, though at the time none of it had been considered relevant enough to escalate. The investigation shifted again when forensic teams re-examined physical evidence from Emily's abandoned vehicle using advanced DNA extraction techniques unavailable in the original case. And what they recovered from beneath the passenger seat was not a clean sample, but fragmented biological material embedded in fibers that had survived heat, time, and contamination, and when those fragments were carefully reconstructed into a partial profile, the results were not immediately conclusive, but they pointed toward a male contributor whose genetic markers partially matched individuals already in the case file, narrowing possibilities in a way that modernized forensic systems could now interpret with far greater sensitivity than anything available in the 1990s. And when those results were compared against voluntarily collected reference samples from multiple individuals previously interviewed in the case, one match rose above statistical noise, incomplete but consistent enough to demand attention, and that match was linked to Daniel Grayson, a finding that transformed him from a distant family figure into a person of renewed investigative interest. The re-interview of Daniel was conducted under controlled conditions in a neutral facility, with recording equipment activated from the moment he entered the room, and initially his demeanor reflected confidence. even irritation at being pulled back into a case he believed had long been resolved. Speaking in rehearsed explanations about memory, family stress, and the tragedy of unresolved loss, but when confronted with the forensic results, his behavior changed in subtle but noticeable ways, pauses extending slightly too long between sentences, eyes breaking contact with investigators, hands shifting in controlled but increasingly rigid movements, and when asked directly about his vehicle, his whereabouts on the night of Emily's disappearance, and his past interactions with her in the weeks leading up to it, his answers became less precise, more fragmented, and eventually defensive, until the moment detectives presented the DNA findings, at which point the atmosphere in the room shifted completely, not into confession, but into withdrawal, and he requested legal representation without further explanation, ending the interview abruptly and leaving investigators with the first moment of procedural resistance that suggested they had moved closer to something significant. Outside the interrogation room, the impact of that development spread quickly through the case team, dividing opinion almost immediately between those who believed they were finally circling the truth and those who cautioned that partial DNA evidence and circumstantial overlap were not enough to build a prosecutable case. But what no one could ignore was the emotional rupture that followed within Emily's family, because once Daniel's name moved from background presence to central focus, memories that had once seemed harmless began to reconfigure themselves under suspicion. Conversations were re-examined. Past interactions were replayed with new interpretation, and family members who had once stood shoulder to shoulder during searches now found themselves questioning what they had witnessed and what they had chosen not to see, including a detail recalled by Emily's sister about a night weeks before the disappearance, when Emily returned home unusually quiet, refusing to discuss an argument she had earlier that evening, only saying that she did not want to be alone with certain relatives. A statement that at the time had been dismissed as emotional stress, but now carried a different weight entirely. As pressure mounted, investigators expanded their scope beyond Emily's case, revisiting other disappearances in the region from the early 1990s, mapping them against known locations associated with Daniel's employment history and personal movements. And what emerged was a disturbing overlap of geography and timing, with at least 2 other cases showing similarities in victim profile, disappearance circumstances, and eventual discovery locations in remote desert zones, suggesting either coincidence on an improbable scale or a pattern that had gone undetected for over a decade. And while prosecutors remained cautious about drawing conclusions, analysts within the task force began referring internally to a potential corridor effect. A stretch of terrain where victims had last been seen and later recovered, a corridor that intersected with construction sites, service roads, and low-traffic highways where a single vehicle could move unnoticed under cover of darkness. The public response to these developments was immediate and volatile once fragments of information leaked to the press, with news outlets reviving the long-dormant story of Emily Grayson and framing it through the lens of a possible serial offender, while social media speculation filled gaps in official statements with theories that ranged from plausible to wildly inaccurate, and within that noise Emily's family found themselves once again under scrutiny, forced to relive interviews from years earlier, defend past statements, and confront the uncomfortable reality that grief and memory do not always preserve truth in the same way, especially when filtered through trauma and time. And among all of this pressure, one detail became increasingly central to investigators. A prior incident report from 1991 involving Daniel Grayson and an accusation of unlawful restraint at a gas station, a case that had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, but now appeared in a different light when placed alongside current forensic and behavioral patterns. Not as proof of guilt, but as an early signal of behavior that had never been fully understood or properly contextualized. Still, even with all of this converging evidence, the investigation remained legally incomplete because cold cases do not yield to patterns alone. They require confirmation that meets a threshold beyond probability, and in Emily Grayson's case, that threshold remained just out of reach. Held back by the absence of a definitive crime scene link, a final piece that would transform suspicion into prosecution, and as the desert continued to give up fragments of the past, bone by bone, trace by trace, Investigators were left with a growing certainty that they were no longer searching for whether something had happened to Emily Grayson, but rather how long the truth had been sitting beneath their feet while everyone involved believed they were still looking in the right direction. The moment investigators began treating Daniel Grayson not as a peripheral witness, but as a subject of sustained behavioral mapping, the entire shape of the case changed, because cold cases do not transform through single revelations, but through accumulation. Through the slow pressure of details that were once harmless becoming structurally unstable when placed beside one another, and in Emily Grayson's disappearance that pressure began building in places no one had thought to look before, starting with something as simple as time and movement. Reconstructed from archived work logs, fuel receipts, and fragmented employment records that showed where Daniel had been working in the months surrounding August 1995, and when those locations were plotted against Emily's known last movements. Investigators noticed something that immediately demanded caution, not because it proved anything on its own, but because it repeated too often to dismiss as coincidence. A pattern of proximity that suggested he was consistently within the same geographic orbit as the victim during critical windows of time, and while defense experts would later argue that family members often share overlapping environments, detectives countered internally that the consistency of timing, not just location, was what made the pattern unsettling, especially when aligned with witness descriptions of a dark pickup truck seen near the diner on the night Emily vanished. The next shift came from an unexpected source, a retired clerk from a small roadside gas station who had once provided a vague statement in 1995 but never been formally re-interviewed. And when investigators approached her decades later, she initially struggled to recall anything beyond general impressions, until she was shown a series of photographs including vehicles and individuals linked to the original case. And at that moment, she hesitated longer than any other image before pointing to a faded photograph of Daniel's truck, not with certainty, but with a discomfort that suggested recognition without clarity, explaining that she remembered a man who used to come in late at night, always alone, always paying in cash, sometimes appearing agitated, sometimes calm, but always asking about remote roads leading out toward the desert, and while she admitted she could not be sure of dates or identity, what she did remember with unsettling clarity was that after one of those visits, she heard about a missing girl in the area within days, a detail that investigators carefully recorded but did not yet elevate to conclusive evidence. Though it added another fragment to a growing mosaic of proximity and timing that refused to dissipate under scrutiny. At the same time, forensic analysts returned to the original burial site where Emily's remains had been discovered, conducting a more exhaustive soil and terrain study using updated geospatial scanning technology that allowed them to reconstruct disturbance patterns in the ground beyond what was visible at the surface. And what they identified was not just a single burial point, but subtle irregularities, suggesting movement of soil in multiple stages, implying that the site may have been revisited after the initial interment, a possibility that introduced a disturbing new dimension to the case. Because it suggested the location was not merely a disposal site, but potentially a remembered place, one that someone had returned to either to confirm concealment or to relive it, and when investigators overlaid those coordinates with known construction routes and employment records, Daniel's name appeared once again within a plausible radius of access, reinforcing suspicion without yet crossing the threshold into proof. Pressure within the investigative team intensified when an anonymous letter arrived at the county sheriff's office, containing no confession and no explicit accusation, but instead a series of precise geographic references to remote desert stretches that had not yet been publicly disclosed in relation to the case, along with a short message stating that the ground remembers what people forget. And while anonymous tips are often disregarded in cold case investigations due to their unreliability, what made this one different was the specificity of the locations mentioned, several of which aligned with historical missing persons routes from the early 1990s that had not been widely publicized, prompting investigators to conduct controlled searches in those areas using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver detection units. And although initial sweeps did not produce immediate discoveries, they did confirm something critical, that the terrain in those locations showed subtle inconsistencies consistent with prior excavation and refilling. suggesting that the desert corridor under investigation may have been used repeatedly over time for concealment. As the scope of the investigation widened, so too did internal debate about whether the evidence being gathered was forming a coherent case or simply an overfitted narrative built on retrospective interpretation. Because experienced detectives knew how easily cold cases could become distorted when every detail was viewed through the lens of a single suspect, and yet the persistence of overlap between Daniel's movements, vehicle descriptions, and geographic clusters of disappearances made it increasingly difficult for even skeptical analysts to ignore the convergence, especially when combined with a psychological profile being developed by behavioral specialists who noted a consistent pattern in Daniel's documented history of conflict avoidance in formal settings, contrasted with reported instances of control-seeking behavior in informal environments, including the earlier 1991 incident that had been dismissed at the time, but now appeared less isolated when viewed alongside emerging patterns of alleged intimidation and restraint in witness recollections. Meanwhile, Emily's family fracture deepened as investigators continued to re-interview relatives under updated protocols designed to reduce suggestion bias, and in doing so uncovered emotional inconsistencies that had never been fully explored, including conflicting memories of Daniel's presence during family gatherings in the weeks before Emily disappeared, with some relatives recalling him as unusually attentive and protective, while others remembered subtle tension between him and Emily that had not been previously acknowledged publicly, and one particularly significant recollection emerged from a distant cousin who stated that Emily had once confided discomfort about someone in the family who always knew where she was. A statement that had been interpreted at the time as general anxiety, but now carried implications that investigators could not ignore, though they still treated it cautiously due to the unreliability of memory under trauma. The case took another turn when financial records tied to Daniel were re-examined using modern forensic accounting methods, revealing irregular cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to Emily's disappearance, not large enough individually to be alarming, but consistent in timing and pattern with periods when he was documented to be in the same general region as her last known locations, and while cash transactions alone could not establish criminal activity, they contributed to a behavioral timeline that suggested deliberate movement rather than coincidence, especially when paired with fuel purchase records indicating extended travel routes that did not align with known employment requirements. And although defense analysts would later argue that such patterns could be explained by personal travel or unrecorded work, investigators noted that no corroborating evidence of such activities existed in any accessible documentation from that period. As suspicion intensified, attempts were made to re-engage Daniel under controlled legal pressure, but each attempt resulted in delayed responses, legal obstruction, or complete refusal, further limiting direct access to his statements and forcing investigators to rely increasingly on indirect evidence, which in turn increased internal tension within the task force. As some members pushed for early prosecution based on cumulative circumstantial weight, while others warned that proceeding without definitive physical linkage to the homicide itself risked collapsing the case in court. And this divide created a procedural standoff that slowed formal advancement even as informal certainty within parts of the investigative team continued to grow. Outside the investigative framework, public interest surged once again as fragments of information leaked, reigniting media attention around Emily Grayson's disappearance and framing it within broader narratives of unsolved desert crimes. And with that renewed attention came renewed pressure on law enforcement to deliver resolution, though internally investigators understood that resolution was still distant, because despite the growing convergence of evidence, one critical element remained missing: the final physical connection that would bind Daniel Grayson not just to proximity or behavior or opportunity, but directly to the act itself. And until that connection was found, the desert would continue to hold its silence, not as an absence of truth, but as a delay in its revelation, stretching the case into a space where certainty was growing but still not yet allowed to speak in the language of conviction. The investigation reached a point where silence itself began to feel like resistance, as if the case was no longer simply being studied but actively pushing back against every attempt to force it into closure. And in that atmosphere of mounting pressure, the task force, made a decision that shifted everything from passive analysis to active intrusion, authorizing a series of coordinated search warrants across properties connected to Daniel Grayson's past, not because they had reached certainty, but because the accumulation of partial truths had become too dense to ignore any longer, and the first of those searches took place at a storage facility on the outskirts of Glendale, a long row of metal units baking under desert sun where forgotten belongings accumulated behind rusting doors. And investigators moved through the narrow aisles with a sense of anticipation that bordered on dread because experience had taught them that cold cases often reveal their most important truths not in dramatic confessions, but in ordinary containers opened years too late. And when they cut the lock on Unit 47, they did not expect much beyond tools, furniture, or discarded remnants of a life that had once been functional. But what they found instead was a carefully maintained space that felt less like abandonment and more like preservation. With shelves organized too deliberately, boxes labeled in handwriting that did not match any known samples from Daniel's official records, and among those items, a small metal toolbox that immediately drew attention because it was unusually clean compared to everything else, as if it had been handled with care far beyond its practical value. And when forensic technicians opened it, they discovered tools consistent with mechanical work, but also a spool of electrical wire that matched, under preliminary analysis, the same gauge and insulation pattern recovered from the bindings at Emily Grayson's burial site, a detail that instantly elevated the search from circumstantial to potentially evidentiary, because while wire is common, this specific combination of manufacturing markings and aging characteristics narrowed its origin to a limited production batch distributed regionally in the early 1990s, and when procurement records were cross-referenced, investigators found that a small number of hardware suppliers in the Phoenix corridor had distributed that exact batch, including one store where Daniel had been documented making frequent cash purchases during that time period, creating the first tangible bridge between his personal activity and the physical mechanics of the crime scene. But it was not the wire alone that changed the tone of the investigation. It was what was found beneath it, hidden at the bottom of the toolbox beneath layers of grease-stained cloth, a folded piece of fabric sealed inside a plastic bag, and when forensics carefully extracted and analyzed it, they identified trace fibers consistent with clothing worn by Emily Grayson on the night of her disappearance. Not enough for absolute certainty, but enough to demand immediate escalation. Because the presence of victim-associated material in a controlled private storage environment linked to a suspect was no longer a theoretical connection. It was a physical convergence that could not be explained by coincidence or innocent transfer. And when this discovery was presented to senior prosecutors, the language of the case shifted for the first time from person of interest to primary suspect under active evidentiary review, though even then legal caution prevented formal charges, because prosecutors still required a direct linkage to cause of death or burial intent that would survive courtroom scrutiny. At the same time, a second search operation was conducted at a rural property once used intermittently by Daniel for vehicle maintenance work, a small parcel of land bordered by desert scrub and abandoned fencing where rusted equipment lay half-buried in sand. And while initial sweeps again produced nothing immediately conclusive, ground-penetrating radar revealed a subsurface anomaly approximately 50 meters from an old shed structure, an irregularity in soil density that suggested past excavation. And when excavation teams began careful removal of layers of compacted earth, they uncovered not a body, but something equally significant in investigative terms. A shallow disturbance containing fragments of rope fibers and additional lengths of electrical wire matching the same specifications as those found in the storage unit, suggesting that materials associated with restraint and binding may have been staged, prepared, or disposed of at multiple locations, reinforcing the emerging theory that the desert corridor under investigation was not a single dumping site, but part of a repeated behavioral pattern spanning multiple years. Meanwhile, forensic anthropologists revisited Emily Grayson's remains with renewed focus, this time applying microscopic trauma analysis to the binding marks on her wrists, and what they discovered introduced a new layer of specificity that investigators had not previously been able to articulate. Because the pattern of compression and abrasion indicated a knotting technique that was not random but consistent with mechanical familiarity, likely learned through hands-on work involving wiring, fastening, or load securing. A detail that aligned uncomfortably well with Daniel's documented employment history as a mechanic, and while defense experts would later argue that such skills are common among tradespeople, prosecutors began to view the convergence of behavioral, geographic, and forensic indicators as increasingly difficult to separate into independent coincidences. The psychological pressure within the task force intensified when a breakthrough came not from physical evidence, but from a renewed witness interview conducted under enhanced memory retrieval protocols involving a former coworker from the diner where Emily was last seen, who, after initially maintaining uncertainty, eventually recalled a detail that had never been emphasized in earlier statements, specifically that on the night of Emily's disappearance she appeared to be avoiding the parking lot entirely, repeatedly asking staff to escort her outside and then changing her mind at the last moment, behavior that suggested anticipation of a specific threat rather than general anxiety. And when shown a composite timeline reconstructed from modern analysis, the witness became visibly unsettled, stating that she now remembered seeing Emily pause near the back exit, as if recognizing someone before quickly retreating inside. A fragment of memory that investigators interpreted cautiously, but which aligned with the theory that Emily may have encountered someone familiar enough to bypass her initial defenses. As this new testimony circulated within the investigative team, attention returned once again to Daniel Grayson's behavior in the days leading up to the disappearance, and a deeper review of archived phone records revealed something that had been overlooked in earlier examinations. Multiple short-duration calls placed from payphones located along routes connecting his known work sites to the diner area, calls that lasted too briefly to trace content, but occurred with enough frequency to suggest coordination of movement rather than coincidence. And while no direct conversation could be proven, the pattern added yet another layer of proximity during the critical window of time, reinforcing the emerging profile of someone who is not simply nearby, but consistently positioned within operational reach of the victim. The case reached a critical inflection point when prosecutors authorized a controlled confrontation interview with Daniel, not as a formal interrogation but as a strategic evidentiary engagement designed to test behavioral response under increasing specificity of accusation. And when he entered the room this time, the atmosphere was markedly different from previous encounters, no longer defined by confidence or irritation but by a guarded stillness that suggested awareness of shifting legal ground. And as investigators gradually introduced details of the storage unit, the wire analysis, and the fiber evidence, his responses began to fragment in ways that trained interviewers immediately recognized as significant, not because of overt confession, but because of the increasing difficulty in maintaining coherent denial across multiple independent lines of evidence. And at one point, when asked to explain how victim-linked fibers could have entered his possession, he paused longer than before and responded not with denial, but with a statement that he did not remember everything from that time, a phrase that, while not incriminating on its own, marked a psychological transition from rejection of involvement to erosion of certainty in his own narrative. Outside the interview room, prosecutors debated whether the threshold for arrest had finally been reached, because while the case had accumulated an unprecedented convergence of forensic, behavioral, and geographic evidence, it still lacked a single definitive act-specific marker such as a direct confession, eyewitness identification of the crime itself, or undisputed physical transfer evidence at the moment of disappearance, and this legal hesitation created a fragile tension within the investigation, where confidence in internal analysis was beginning to exceed what courts would comfortably accept, and yet delaying further action carried its own risk. Because investigators feared that continued exposure of their strategy might prompt destruction of remaining evidence or irreversible alteration of key locations. And so the case stood at the edge of transition, suspended between reconstruction and resolution, with Emily Grayson's final night no longer obscured by mystery, but increasingly defined by converging fragments that pointed toward a single individual whose presence had once been unquestioned, whose role had once been trusted, and whose connection to the victim now shaped every unanswered question still buried in the Arizona desert, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when suspicion would finally become certainty, and the silence that had lasted for years would be forced to speak in a language the law could no longer ignore. The turning point did not arrive with celebration or clarity, but with a slow procedural shift that felt almost imperceptible at first, like a change in pressure before a storm breaks, as prosecutors finally authorized a full-scale evidentiary consolidation of everything tied to Daniel Grayson, meaning that every fragment of information gathered over years, physical, behavioral, geographical, and testimonial, was no longer treated as separate threads, but as a single structure under legal review. And once that structure was assembled in one place, in one room, under one analytical framework, its weight became impossible to ignore, because what had once looked like scattered coincidences began aligning with a disturbing consistency that no longer required imagination to connect, only recognition. And the first time senior investigators saw the full reconstructed timeline laid across a digital mapping system, there was a long silence in the room that no one interrupted, because the pattern that emerged was not random, not ambiguous, but directional. As if someone had moved through the landscape with intention rather than drift, returning again and again to specific corridors of desert roadways, industrial edges, and isolated access points that formed a repeating geometry around Emily Grayson's last known movements. At the center of that reconstruction stood the night of August 14th, 1995, now no longer treated as an isolated disappearance, but as the convergence point of multiple overlapping systems of behavior, and when analysts overlaid Daniel Grayson's verified locations, vehicle sightings, and financial transactions onto that single 24-hour window, they observed something that immediately changed the emotional tone of the investigation, because it was not just proximity that appeared, but synchronization. Small but repeated alignments in time that suggested presence in multiple relevant zones within windows too narrow to be comfortably explained by coincidence. And while defense-oriented analysts within the department attempted to introduce alternative explanations, such as shared regional mobility or unrecorded work routes, those theories began to weaken under the sheer repetition of alignment across multiple independent datasets. Especially when combined with witness accounts that placed a dark pickup truck near the diner during the critical hours before Emily's disappearance, a vehicle now increasingly consistent with Daniel's known ownership during that period. But the most significant development came from a secondary forensic re-examination of Emily Grayson's clothing fragments recovered from the burial site, where modern fiber spectroscopy techniques revealed not just environmental contamination or soil transfer, but trace residues consistent with contact against a treated industrial surface, specifically compounds associated with mechanical workshop environments, including lubricant-based hydrocarbons and microscopic metal particulates, and while such findings could not identify a person directly, they narrowed the environmental context of contact in a way that aligned strikingly with Daniel's documented occupation as a mechanic, adding yet another layer of convergence between personal history and physical evidence. And when this result was introduced during a closed evidentiary briefing, one forensic specialist described it not as proof of identity, but as proof of contextual consistency, meaning that the victim's final interactions were increasingly consistent with environments tied to the suspect's known world. At the same time, behavioral analysts presented a refined profile based on cumulative case data, and while profiling is never treated as standalone evidence, its role in shaping investigative direction became increasingly influential as the case matured, particularly because the behavioral signature reconstructed from witness statements, prior incidents, and interaction patterns suggested a dual-mode presence, outwardly integrated into social and family structures, yet capable of sustained compartmentalization under pressure. A combination that allowed proximity without detection and familiarity without suspicion, and in reviewing Daniel Grayson's documented role in family search efforts, investigators noted the psychological paradox that he had participated in public grief rituals, search coordination, and media engagement while simultaneously existing as a subject of emerging forensic suspicion, a contradiction that created both investigative urgency and emotional instability within the victim's family network. The investigation escalated further when a renewed excavation effort was authorized at a second desert location identified through geospatial pattern analysis. A remote stretch of land that had not been formally linked to Emily Grayson's case during the original investigation but now fell within the expanded behavioral corridor defined by repeated historical disappearances, and while initial surface searches revealed nothing, subsurface scanning detected anomalies consistent with prior soil disruption, leading to a controlled excavation that uncovered fragmented evidence materials, including additional lengths of electrical wire, degraded synthetic fibers, and small personal artifacts that could not yet be definitively assigned to any known victim, but that expanded the operational scope of the case beyond a single incident, suggesting instead a repeated methodology applied across time. And although prosecutors remained cautious about labeling the pattern as serial activity without definitive attribution, internally the investigative team had begun to treat the corridor as a linked behavioral environment rather than isolated crime scenes. Within this expanding framework, the emotional impact on Emily Grayson's family intensified dramatically as long-buried memories resurfaced under renewed scrutiny. And statements that had once been interpreted as emotional instability or grief distortion began to be reevaluated as potential indicators of earlier awareness, including recollections from Emily's sister describing moments when Emily appeared hesitant to attend certain family gatherings or expressed discomfort around specific individuals without fully articulating why, and while such recollections could not be treated as factual evidence, they contributed to a psychological reconstruction of the victim's final months that suggested increasing internal caution, a behavioral shift that aligned with the theory of perceived threat escalation prior to disappearance. As pressure mounted, investigators attempted once more to secure a direct evidentiary bridge by revisiting digital and archived communication systems from the mid-1990s, focusing on payphone logs, credit transactions, and service station surveillance records that could corroborate movement patterns during the critical timeline. And although much of the infrastructure from that era no longer existed, fragmented data recovery yielded several indirect confirmations of travel behavior that aligned with known routes between Daniel's employment sites and Emily's last confirmed location, including short-duration payphone contacts that appeared to cluster around transitional travel periods, suggesting coordination or monitoring activity rather than random movement, though without content these findings remained circumstantial in isolation. The most emotionally destabilizing moment in this phase of the investigation occurred during a supervised family review session in which prosecutors allowed select members of Emily Grayson's family to view a curated reconstruction of the evidence timeline. Not as a public presentation, but as an internal acknowledgement of investigative direction, and as the visual map displayed overlapping routes, witness points, forensic locations, and temporal intersections. The realization spread through the room not as a single shock but as a gradual collapse of uncertainty, because what they were seeing was not speculation but structure, a pattern too consistent to ignore, yet still not legally complete. And in that silence, one family member reportedly whispered that it felt like watching a life being reconstructed backward into its final hour without ever being able to stop it from happening. Despite the growing convergence, legal barriers remained firmly in place, because prosecutors continued to emphasize that convergence is not equivalence, and that even the most compelling aggregation of circumstantial evidence must ultimately satisfy strict evidentiary thresholds before an arrest can be sustained in court, and this tension created an increasingly unstable balance between investigative certainty and procedural restraint, with detectives growing more confident in the narrative forming beneath the evidence, while legal teams remained cautious about moving too quickly without a direct physical linkage tying Daniel Grayson to the act of homicide itself. And so the case entered a phase defined not by discovery but by compression, where every new fragment no longer expanded the narrative but tightened it, reducing ambiguity while increasing pressure. As if the investigation itself was closing in on a point where interpretation would no longer be necessary, and in that narrowing space the Arizona desert remained unchanged on the surface, vast and indifferent. But beneath it the past was no longer buried in silence. It was being assembled piece by piece into something that was approaching inevitability, waiting for the final connection that would turn accumulated suspicion into irreversible truth. The moment the arrest warrant was first drafted, it did not feel like triumph inside the task force. It felt like a release of pressure that had been building for years without permission to fully break. Because everyone in that room understood the difference between believing something and being able to prove it in a court of law, and yet the accumulation of evidence surrounding Daniel Grayson had reached a point where hesitation itself began to look like negligence. And so the prosecutors moved forward not with certainty, but with what they called structured confidence, a legal threshold built not on a single breakthrough but on the convergence of multiple independent systems pointing toward the same conclusion. And once that decision was made, the machinery of law enforcement shifted immediately from analysis to execution. Warrants were finalized, tactical units briefed, and surveillance teams positioned around known and potential residences, all while maintaining strict operational silence to prevent any possibility of flight or destruction of remaining evidence. The arrest itself took place early in the morning, just before sunrise, when the desert is still cold enough to feel almost neutral, as if the heat of accusation has not yet reached the ground. And Daniel Grayson was located at a modest residence on the outskirts of a residential subdivision in Glendale, a place that from the outside appeared unremarkable, ordinary even, with a parked vehicle in the driveway and no visible signs of disturbance. Until a knock came at the door and the stillness of the morning fractured into coordinated movement, officers announcing themselves clearly, executing the warrant with controlled precision. And when Daniel opened the door, there was a brief moment, documented by body camera footage, in which he did not speak or react, only observed, as if trying to place the situation into a category he could understand. Before being informed that he was under arrest in connection with the disappearance and presumed murder of Emily Grayson, and in that instant the case that had existed for decades as theory and investigation collapsed into physical reality, because once a suspect is placed in custody, the abstract becomes irreversible. Inside the residence, search teams moved quickly but methodically, securing digital devices, personal documents, and any materials that could provide evidentiary linkage or contextual confirmation, while outside neighbors gathered in small clusters at the edges of their driveways, watching in silence as years of rumor and distance suddenly condensed into a single visible event. And investigators noted later that what struck them most was not the reaction of the suspect but the reaction of the environment. Because spaces that had once been ordinary were now reinterpreted in real time through the lens of everything that had been discovered prior to this moment, every fiber, every witness statement, every reconstructed timeline now collapsing into a single focal point. At the station, Daniel was placed in an interrogation room that had already been prepared with evidentiary displays, not as theatrical presentation but as structured disclosure designed to document responses under controlled conditions, and when he was first brought in he remained composed. Seated upright, hands still, eyes scanning the room with a controlled detachment that investigators initially interpreted as rehearsed composure, and the first phase of questioning focused not on accusation but on confirmation of basic facts, movements, employment history, family interactions, known travel routes, questions that he answered with cautious precision, neither volunteering additional detail nor directly resisting, until the interrogation shifted towards specific evidentiary items recovered during the search operations, at which point subtle changes in behavior began to emerge, including delayed responses, repeated clarifications, and an increasing tendency to frame answers in generalities rather than specifics. When presented with the storage unit evidence, the electrical wire, the toolbox, and the fiber traces linked to Emily Grayson, his reaction remained controlled but visibly constrained, as if navigating between denial and the need to maintain consistency. And he reiterated earlier explanations regarding environmental transfer and incidental contact, arguments that had been anticipated by investigators and already tested against forensic limitations, and it was only when the discussion shifted to the reconstructed geospatial timeline, showing repeated convergence of his movements with Emily's last known location, that the tone in the room changed perceptibly, because this was not a single piece of evidence to be explained away, but a pattern of behavior distributed across time. And patterns are significantly harder to dismiss than isolated facts. Outside the interrogation room, prosecutors monitored proceedings in real time, evaluating not just the content of responses, but the structure of psychological resistance, noting that Daniel's defenses were shifting from categorical denial toward conditional framing. a transition often associated with increasing cognitive strain under evidentiary pressure. And while this alone was not proof of guilt, it contributed to a growing internal consensus that the threshold for formal charging had been met, particularly given the convergence of forensic, testimonial, and behavioral data already in possession of the state. One of the most significant moments occurred when investigators introduced the updated forensic analysis of Emily Grayson's remains, specifically the refined interpretation of binding marks and fiber residue. And when this was presented alongside the known occupational background of Daniel as a mechanic, there was a brief pause that extended longer than previous ones, followed by a statement in which he questioned the reliability of retrospective forensic interpretation, suggesting that too much time had passed for certainty. And while this argument was not unusual in cold case interrogations, its delivery marked a shift from factual explanation to systemic challenge, indicating an attempt to undermine methodology rather than address specific evidence points. Meanwhile, parallel teams continued processing digital and documentary evidence seized during the arrest, and within hours analysts began reconstructing communication patterns from recovered devices and archived records, identifying clusters of activity that aligned with previously established timelines, including repeated short communications during key transitional periods in August 1995, and although content could not be fully recovered due to technological limitations of the era, metadata alone was sufficient to reinforce the emerging model of coordinated movement within the critical timeframe of Emily's disappearance. The emotional impact of the arrest extended far beyond the investigative team, immediately reaching Emily Grayson's family, who were notified through official channels before any public announcement was made, and the reaction was not uniform. Because decades of unresolved grief had created internal divisions regarding suspicion and loyalty, and while some family members experienced the arrest as long-delayed validation of fears they had quietly held for years, others struggled with disbelief, unable to reconcile the individual they had known within family contexts with the emerging investigative profile. And this psychological fracture became an additional layer of complexity in the case, because memory, once destabilized by new information, rarely returns to its original form. As news of the arrest eventually reached the public, media coverage intensified immediately, framing the case as both resolution and revelation, emphasizing the shocking proximity of the suspect to the victim's family and the decades-long delay in resolution. While legal representatives cautioned against premature conclusions, reiterating that an arrest is not a conviction and that the judicial process would now determine the final outcome, but within the investigative community the focus had already shifted. Because the arrest had transformed the case from speculative reconstruction into active prosecution, meaning that every remaining fragment of evidence would now be evaluated not for possibility, but for admissibility and corroboration. Yet even in custody, one element remained unresolved, and investigators knew it, because despite the overwhelming convergence of circumstantial and forensic evidence, the precise mechanics of Emily Grayson's final moments had not been fully reconstructed. Nor had the exact sequence of events leading from disappearance to burial been definitively established, leaving a critical gap between established presence and proven action, and that gap, however small in narrative terms, remained legally significant. Because in the justice system the difference between likely and proven is not emotional but absolute. And so, as Daniel Grayson sat under fluorescent light in an interrogation room filled with the weight of decades of investigation finally converging upon him, the case that had begun in silence in the Arizona desert had reached its most concrete moment yet, but not its final one, because even now, even at the point of arrest, the desert still held part of its story unspoken, and what remained was not the question of whether the past had been uncovered, but whether it could be fully proven before it slipped once again into the space between memory and law. After the arrest, the case did not accelerate. It compressed, as if all the years of scattered uncertainty were suddenly forced into a single confined space where every detail had to be reevaluated under pressure, and what investigators quickly learned was that custody does not equal clarity. Because once Daniel Grayson was inside the system, protected by procedure and counsel, the investigation lost access to the psychological openness that had previously allowed small fractures in his narrative to surface, replaced instead by structured silence, carefully measured statements, and legal barriers that transformed every question into a potential liability rather than an opportunity for truth. And this shift forced the task force to pivot again, moving away from interrogation as a primary tool and toward pure reconstruction, building the case outward from physical evidence rather than inward from behavior. The first priority became digital recovery, because every device seized during the arrest represented a potential archive of movement, communication, and behavior patterns that could either reinforce or destabilize the emerging theory. And forensic analysts began the painstaking process of extracting deleted files, reconstructing metadata chains, and mapping historical communication logs across fragmented systems that had changed multiple times since the mid-1990s. And although much of the earliest data had been lost to technological obsolescence, enough structural remnants remained to identify recurring patterns of activity clusters tied to specific geographic transitions, particularly routes connecting residential zones in Glendale with outlying desert corridors. And while no explicit content linking Daniel directly to Emily's disappearance could be recovered, the consistency of movement metadata during critical windows continued to align with previously established investigative timelines, reinforcing the idea that presence, not communication, was the central behavioral marker in this case. At the same time, forensic teams returned once again to the physical evidence recovered from the storage unit, applying newer chemical mapping techniques to the electrical wire and fiber samples, and what they discovered was not a dramatic revelation but a tightening of specificity. Because trace compounds embedded in the insulation suggested exposure to a controlled mechanical environment, with consistent chemical signatures matching a limited range of workshop conditions, narrowing the potential origin further into a category that aligned strongly with Daniel's documented professional background. And while this still did not identify a person directly, it strengthened the environmental consistency argument to a degree that prosecutors began to describe internally as contextual convergence, a term used when multiple independent evidence streams align toward a single interpretive framework without yet producing direct eyewitness or confessional confirmation. Meanwhile, behavioral analysts expanded their reconstruction of Daniel's long-term patterns, focusing on how his documented life history interacted with moments of crisis or proximity to victims in other cases under review. And what emerged was a pattern of compartmentalization that investigators found increasingly significant, because individuals capable of maintaining consistent social integration while simultaneously engaging in concealed harmful behavior often exhibit stable outward routines combined with irregular private deviations. And in Daniel's case, those deviations appeared most clearly in the form of unexplained travel windows, irregular financial withdrawals, and repeated presence near geographically sensitive zones during periods aligned with multiple disappearances. And while each element could be rationalized independently, their cumulative structure resisted benign interpretation. The emotional dimension of the case also intensified during this phase, particularly within Emily Grayson's family, who were now transitioning from anticipation of resolution to confrontation with its psychological consequences. Because arrest does not restore what was lost but instead redefines it under legal language, transforming memory into evidence and grief into testimony. And during structured family briefings conducted by prosecutors, relatives were shown partial reconstructions of the investigative timeline, including mapped movements, forensic linkages, and reconstructed behavioral corridors, and the experience was described by some participants as disorienting, not because it revealed something entirely unknown, but because it rearranged known fragments into a form that felt inevitable, as if the outcome had always been embedded within the structure of events, but only now made visible through systematic analysis. Inside the detention facility, Daniel Grayson's legal defense began to take shape rapidly, focusing on dismantling the interpretive framework of the investigation rather than addressing individual pieces of evidence, arguing that proximity does not equal participation, that occupational overlap explains environmental traces, and that retrospective reconstruction is inherently vulnerable to confirmation bias. And these arguments, while standard in criminal defense strategy, forced investigators to confront the central challenge of the case once again, which was that no single piece of evidence was independently definitive, and that the strength of the case depended entirely on the integrity of its convergence, meaning that if one major pillar collapsed under scrutiny, the entire structure risked destabilization. To counter this, prosecutors initiated a comprehensive evidentiary synthesis, preparing the case for potential indictment by organizing all available material into a legally coherent narrative framework, not as storytelling but as admissible sequencing of facts, where each element had to be defensible on its own before being combined into cumulative argumentation, and this process revealed both strength and vulnerability in the case, because while the convergence remained strong, certain gaps persisted in the direct linkage between Daniel and the moment of Emily's death, particularly in establishing uncontested presence at the exact time of disappearance beyond circumstantial reconstruction. As this legal preparation intensified, investigators revisited one of the earliest unresolved elements of the case, the 11-second answering machine recording from the night Emily vanished, and although the original tape had been preserved, advances in audio enhancement allowed forensic sound analysts to reprocess the recording using noise isolation and spectral reconstruction techniques, revealing subtle background frequencies that had previously been masked, including environmental audio signatures consistent with a vehicle interior and low-frequency mechanical hum patterns that could potentially align with engine idling or movement, and while the voice itself remained partially obscured. Analysts confirmed that the recording environment suggested proximity rather than remote communication, reinforcing the theory that the message had been delivered in close temporal and physical connection to Emily's final moments. This discovery reignited internal debate within the task force, because while it strengthened the argument that Emily's disappearance was not random but actively controlled, it still did not resolve the identity of the speaker or the exact circumstances under which the message was recorded, leaving room for defense challenges regarding interpretation. And yet for investigators who had spent years assembling fragmented patterns, the recording now functioned less as isolated evidence and more as atmospheric confirmation of a controlled encounter, a moment where fear, presence, and communication intersected in a way that aligned with the broader behavioral model they had constructed. As the investigation moved deeper into prosecution readiness, attention also turned to potential corroborative witnesses who had never been formally interviewed during the original investigation, including individuals who had since relocated or aged out of accessibility. And through renewed outreach efforts, investigators identified several previously uncontacted persons who recalled fragments of relevant observations, including sightings of a dark vehicle near desert access roads during late-night hours in the mid-1990s. Though none could provide definitive identification, and while such accounts remained insufficient individually, they added marginal reinforcement to the geographical consistency already established through mapping analysis. By this stage, the case had reached a structural paradox. It was simultaneously one of the most thoroughly reconstructed cold cases in the region's history, and one of the most legally delicate because its strength lay in convergence rather than singular proof, and convergence, while persuasive, always carries the risk of interpretive challenge, and prosecutors understood that any trial would hinge not on whether the pattern made sense, but on whether it could survive adversarial deconstruction under courtroom conditions. And so, as the investigation entered its next phase, the focus shifted once again from discovery to preservation, from finding new evidence to securing the integrity of what had already been found, because everyone involved understood that the final stage of the case would not be about uncovering more truth, but about defending the truth already assembled, and somewhere beyond the procedural frameworks, beyond the forensic reports and legal thresholds, the desert that had once concealed everything remained unchanged, holding within it the original moment of disappearance that no reconstruction, however precise, could ever fully return to light, only approach, piece by piece, until the distance between what happened and what could be proven finally became the defining tension of the entire case. By the time the case entered its 8th phase, it no longer felt like an investigation moving forward in a straight line, but like a tightening spiral circling the same unanswered point from different angles, each rotation bringing it closer to something that refused to fully reveal itself. And inside that pressure cooker of law enforcement urgency and legal restraint, a new development emerged that no one in the task force had anticipated, not because it was impossible, but because it had been buried so deeply in procedural noise that it had effectively ceased to exist in institutional memory. It began with a routine audit. not of suspects, not of witnesses, but of archived evidence transfer logs from the original 1990s investigation, a bureaucratic requirement triggered by the case's formal elevation to active prosecution status. And it was during this audit that a forensic technician noticed an inconsistency in chain of custody documentation tied to a secondary evidence envelope labeled under Emily Grayson's original file number. An envelope that had been cataloged as non-relevant trace debris during the first wave of investigation and subsequently transferred into long-term storage without further analysis, and under normal circumstances, it would have remained there indefinitely. But modern digitization protocols required rescanning of all archived materials for integrity verification, and that process revealed something that had never been properly examined. Inside the envelope was not a collection of meaningless debris, as previously recorded, but a small cluster of compacted material that included degraded fabric fibers, dried organic residue, and most significantly, a fragment of metal alloy shaped irregularly, as if broken from a larger object under stress rather than naturally fragmented. And when this material was subjected to high-resolution metallurgical analysis, it revealed a composition consistent with a specific type of utility blade commonly used in mechanical workshops during the early 1990s. A detail that alone would not have been remarkable except for one critical connection. Microscopic traces embedded along the fracture edges contained residue matching the same soil composition found at the primary burial site in the Arizona desert. That connection changed the tone of the entire investigation, because it was no longer just a question of proximity, behavior, or environmental overlap. It was a physical link between an object used in an act of force and the soil where Emily Grayson's body had been concealed. For the first time since the arrest, prosecutors had something approaching direct evidentiary continuity. But the discovery did not stand alone for long. Within 48 hours, a second breakthrough emerged from an entirely separate direction when a retired utility worker from a defunct roadside maintenance contractor contacted authorities after seeing renewed media coverage of the case. And although he initially claimed to remember nothing specific, he eventually described an incident from the mid-1990s involving a dark pickup truck parked near an isolated service access point off a desert highway, where he had been called to repair a damaged utility box that had been forcibly opened, and inside that box, according to his recollection, he had noticed electrical wiring that had been crudely cut and reconnected in a manner that did not match standard repair procedures. And while he had not reported it at the time because it fell outside his assignment scope, he now recalled something else, an object partially buried nearby that he had assumed was discarded equipment, but which in hindsight resembled personal belongings that did not belong in that environment. When investigators followed up, they located the original site based on his description, and although decades of environmental exposure had altered the terrain significantly, ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beneath the surface consistent with disturbed soil patterns that did not match natural erosion, prompting a controlled excavation under forensic supervision, and what they uncovered was not a full burial site, but something equally important in evidentiary terms, a secondary deposit zone containing fragmented personal items, including a damaged piece of jewelry later identified by Emily Grayson's family as consistent with one of her missing accessories, along with additional lengths of electrical wire matching those recovered from both the storage unit and the original burial context. For investigators, this was the moment the case structure fundamentally changed. Because until that point, all evidence had pointed toward a single event, a single location, a single act of disposal. But now there was clear indication of repeated contact with multiple sites across time, suggesting not only concealment but potential relocation, revisitation, or staged dispersal of evidence in a way that implied behavioral complexity far beyond opportunistic disposal. Inside the task force, this development triggered immediate reclassification discussions, with analysts now openly considering whether Emily Grayson's case was part of a broader behavioral pattern rather than an isolated incident, though prosecutors remained cautious about formal language, knowing that expanding the scope too quickly could introduce legal vulnerabilities in court. But the most significant consequence of the discovery was not theoretical, it was strategic, because the new site introduced the possibility of reconstructing a sequence of events rather than a single endpoint. And sequences, in legal terms, are far more powerful than snapshots. At the same time, interrogation strategy shifted once again. Daniel Grayson, who had until this point maintained strict procedural silence beyond limited legal statements, was brought in for a renewed evidentiary session, this time with the updated discoveries introduced in a controlled, incremental format designed to observe behavioral response rather than extract verbal admission, and what investigators observed was not collapse, but adaptation. He did not deny the existence of the evidence. He questioned its interpretation. He challenged continuity between locations. He reframed the presence of objects as environmental contamination or unrelated disposal activity. But what stood out to experienced interrogators was not what he said, it was what he avoided addressing directly. Every time the discussion moved toward specific temporal sequencing, his responses became less anchored, more abstract, shifting away from concrete denial into generalized commentary about memory reliability, passage of time, and investigative reconstruction limitations. To prosecutors, this shift was significant not because it indicated guilt in isolation, but because it demonstrated an inability or unwillingness to engage with precise chronological reconstruction, which was exactly what the new evidence demanded. Outside the interrogation room, forensic psychologists began compiling a refined behavioral timeline based on all recorded interactions, and one pattern became increasingly clear. The strongest resistance consistently appeared not when physical evidence was introduced, but when spatial-temporal relationships were mapped explicitly, suggesting a cognitive boundary around reconstructed movement rather than object-based evidence. Meanwhile, Emily Grayson's family was once again brought into structured review sessions, where they were shown a new consolidated reconstruction that now included the secondary site, and for the first time, the narrative was no longer linear disappearance followed by discovery, but a multi-phase model of movement, concealment, and potential secondary interaction with remains or belongings, and the emotional effect was immediate and destabilizing because it transformed the case from a singular tragedy into something more fragmented and harder to emotionally contain. One family member reportedly asked a question that no one in the room could answer immediately, whether Emily had died where she was found, or whether she had been moved after death. That question, simple in form, created one of the most difficult investigative challenges yet because it required distinguishing between primary and secondary deposition, something that could only be answered through microscopic soil sequencing and degradation pattern modeling, both of which were still ongoing. But even before those results were complete, another breakthrough emerged, this time from digital reconstruction. A forensic audio specialist revisiting the original 11-second voicemail discovered that earlier enhancement attempts had overlooked a low-amplitude directional pattern embedded beneath the noise floor, and after applying a new filtering algorithm designed for spatial audio reconstruction, analysts identified a brief directional shift in ambient sound consistent with a moving vehicle, not stationary recording, meaning the message may have been captured during transit rather than at a fixed location. This detail reframed the voicemail entirely, not as a static threat, but as a moment occurring inside motion. And that implication changed everything about how investigators interpreted the timeline of Emily Grayson's final hours. Because if the message was recorded in transit, then Emily's disappearance was not a single event at a single place, but a sequence unfolding across space. And sequences require structure. Structure requires control. And control, in forensic behavioral analysis, narrows possibility rather than expanding it. By the end of this phase, prosecutors were no longer debating whether the case was strong enough to proceed. They were debating how much of it needed to be included to survive challenge. And in the background of every discussion, one reality remained constant and unresolved, despite overwhelming convergence, despite physical links, despite behavioral patterns and reconstructed timelines. The precise moment when Emily Grayson transitioned from missing person to homicide victim still existed in a space the evidence had not fully illuminated. The desert, once again, had given up pieces of its silence. But not yet the final one. By the time the final phase of the investigation began, the case no longer felt like something being solved in real time, but like a long-delayed impact finally arriving after years of travel, because every prior development, the arrest, the forensic confirmations, the the secondary burial site. The reconstructed timelines had already reshaped the narrative so completely that what remained was no longer discovery, but final alignment. And inside the task force, that realization carried a strange kind of tension, not the excitement of resolution, but the pressure of finality. The awareness that once the last pieces were placed, there would be no further room for ambiguity, only conclusion, and that conclusion would either hold or collapse under legal scrutiny. The breakthrough that pushed the case into its final stage came from a convergence of forensic soil sequencing and advanced temporal modeling applied to the primary burial site where Emily Grayson's remains were discovered. And unlike earlier analyses that focused on identification or environmental context, this new examination attempted to reconstruct the sequence of burial disturbance events by layering sediment compression data with thermal degradation patterns, effectively creating a timeline of soil movement rather than just a static snapshot of the grave. And what emerged from this reconstruction was a finding that immediately elevated internal urgency. The burial site showed evidence of at least two distinct phases of disturbance, separated by a measurable environmental gap consistent with re-entry into the location after initial concealment. This meant the grave had not simply been created and left. It had been revisited. That single conclusion altered the entire interpretive framework of the case, because it introduced intent beyond disposal. It suggested awareness, return, and control over time. Prosecutors immediately requested a full evidentiary synthesis meeting, where all previously collected data, from fiber analysis, geospatial mapping, vehicle movement reconstruction, financial records, witness statements, and digital metadata, was presented as a unified model rather than separate investigative threads. And when projected onto a single analytical interface, the convergence was no longer theoretical, it became visually unavoidable. With overlapping trajectories of movement and access forming repeated intersections around three critical zones: the diner where Emily was last seen, the desert burial corridor, and the secondary deposition site discovered during excavation. For the first time, the investigative team described the case not as circumstantial accumulation, but as behavioral geometry. And at the center of that geometry stood Daniel Grayson. However, even with this convergence, prosecutors remained careful because convergence does not equal admissibility unless it can be translated into legally coherent causation, and that required answering a question the investigation had circled for years, but never fully resolved. What was the final sequence of Emily Grayson's last known movements between the diner and the desert? To address that gap, forensic analysts returned to the enhanced voicemail reconstruction, now combining audio-spatial modeling with vehicle motion simulation based on engine harmonic analysis, and what they discovered added a final, unsettling layer of clarity. Because the directional audio signature previously identified was now mapped against reconstructed roadway acoustics, and the pattern strongly suggested that the recording had occurred while a vehicle was traveling along a desert highway corridor consistent with routes connecting the diner's location to the burial zone, meaning that Emily's final recorded moment was not stationary, not isolated, but embedded within motion through the desert itself. This finding reframed the entire case structure. It was no longer a disappearance followed by discovery. It was movement followed by concealment. And that distinction mattered more than anything else in court interpretation. At the same time, prosecutors initiated the final pre-indictment review of Daniel Grayson's custodial statements, behavioral profile, and forensic links, and what stood out most in this review was not any single admission or contradiction, but the consistency of interpretive resistance whenever spatial sequencing was introduced, suggesting a psychological boundary around reconstructed movement events that aligned with the prosecution's emerging theory of controlled transit across multiple locations. But the most decisive moment did not come from evidence alone. It came from legal synthesis. In a closed prosecutorial session, the entire case was reduced to its essential prosecutable elements: presence, opportunity, forensic linkage, behavioral patterning, geographic convergence, and temporal alignment. And when stripped of narrative framing and examined purely under evidentiary standards, the conclusion that emerged was not phrased emotionally, but structurally. The probability of independent coincidence across all categories was statistically untenable under standard forensic modeling. And while that language still fell short of absolute certainty, It met the threshold required for indictment on charges of murder and unlawful concealment of a body. The decision was made. An indictment was filed. And for the first time since the desert first revealed Emily Grayson's remains, the case transitioned fully from investigation to prosecution. Daniel Grayson was formally charged with murder. The public reaction, when it arrived, was immediate and explosive, but within the investigative community, the focus shifted away from announcement and toward preparation. Because indictment is not resolution, it is initiation of a new phase where every piece of evidence must survive adversarial dismantling in court, and prosecutors understood that the strength of their case lay not in any single discovery, but in the integrity of its convergence under legal scrutiny. Meanwhile, Emily Grayson's family entered a different kind of reality. For them, the case was no longer a search or an investigation or even a mystery. It had become a defined legal narrative with named responsibility. And yet, even in that transition, closure remained distant, because legal recognition does not reconstruct lived experience, and it does not restore the missing years between disappearance and discovery. In private meetings with victim advocates and prosecutors, the family was shown the final evidentiary reconstruction, a complete mapped sequence of Emily's last known movements, including diner departure, vehicle transition points, desert corridor travel modeling, and burial site deposition analysis. And while the presentation was designed for clarity, its emotional effect was far more complex, because what it revealed was not just where Emily had gone, but how systematically the investigation had been able to reconstruct absence itself, turning silence into structure and uncertainty into mapped progression. One of the investigators later described the moment after the presentation ended as the end of guessing, because from that point forward, nothing in the case remained hypothetical. Everything was now either admissible or not, proven or not proven, but no longer unknown. And yet, even as the prosecution prepared for trial, one final element continued to resist full resolution: the precise internal narrative of Emily Grayson's final moments, because while movement, location, and forensic contact could now be reconstructed with high confidence, the subjective experience, the fear, recognition, and sequence of human interaction remained beyond the reach of evidence, preserved only in fragments of inference and implication. That absence, investigators understood, would never be filled by science. It belonged to the victim alone. As court preparation intensified, expert witnesses were assembled, forensic models finalized, and evidentiary chains locked into procedural format. The case that had begun as a single discovery in the Arizona desert had become something far larger. A fully reconstructed behavioral landscape spanning years, locations, and interconnected events, all converging toward a single point of legal accountability. And standing at the center of it, now no longer as an implication but as an indicted defendant awaiting trial, was Daniel Grayson, whose life had once been defined by proximity and familiarity, and was now defined entirely by the weight of convergence that had taken decades to assemble. The desert, which had once hidden everything, had finally yielded its structure. But even in full exposure, it offered no comfort, only consequence.